The midnight bell echoes through the narrow cobblestone streets of a medieval city. But while most people are deep in sleep, one workshop is already coming alive with the soft shuffle of feet and the scrape of metal tools. This isn't some grand castle or royal court. It's a humble bakery where magic happens every single night. Welcome to the world of medieval bread making, where master bakers and their apprentices work through the darkest hours to feed entire neighborhoods by sunrise. You might think baking bread is just mixing flour and water, throwing it in an oven, and calling it a day. But medieval bakers were running what amounted to precision operations that would put modern factories to shame. They had no thermometers, no timers, no measuring cups. Yet they consistently produced hundreds of perfect loaves before most people even opened their eyes. Tonight, we're following a master baker and his young apprentice through one complete shift in the year 1300, watching them transform simple ingredients into the foundation of medieval life. If you're fascinated by history that actually matters, the kind that kept entire civilizations fed, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. I promise you'll never look at your morning toast the same way again. And after you watch this, drop a comment telling me what surprised you most about medieval baking. Trust me, there are some techniques these guys used that would blow your mind. Our story begins at midnight in a city somewhere in Western Europe. The master baker, let's call him Willem, has been doing this for 30 years. His hands are permanently dusted with flour. His back is bent from decades of lifting heavy dough, and he can judge oven temperature just by holding his palm near the hearth. Tonight, like every night for the past 3 decades, he's teaching his newest apprentice the ancient art that keeps their community alive. The apprentice, barely 14 years old, stumbles through the dark workshop with sleep still heavy in his eyes. This is his 3rd week on the job, and his muscles still ache from yesterday's kneading marathon. But Willem doesn't believe in taking it easy on beginners. In medieval times, you learned by doing, and you learned fast, or you found yourself another trade. The first task might seem simple, but it's actually crucial to the entire operation. Willem approaches yesterday's oven, where glowing coals still hold the heat from the previous day's baking. These aren't dead ashes, they're treasure. Banking coals properly meant the difference between starting fresh with cold stones or having a head start on today's heat. Willem shows his apprentice how to carefully rake the coals, stirring them just enough to expose the living embers beneath the grey ash. The oven itself is a marvel of medieval engineering that modern bakers would recognize instantly. Built from thick stones and clay, this domed structure can hold heat for hours once properly fired. The apprentice watches as Willem begins feeding small pieces of wood to the banked coals, slowly coaxing the fire back to life. There's an art to this. Too much wood too fast, and you waste fuel. Too little, and you'll never reach proper baking temperature. While the oven begins its slow climb toward bread baking heat, Willem moves to the mixing area where yesterday's work awaits. On a wooden table sits a bowl of something that looks like thick, foamy soup, but smells like a tavern on a busy night. This is the barm, fresh from the local alehouse, where the foam from fermenting beer becomes the magical ingredient that makes bread rise. Medieval bakers understood fermentation in ways that would impress modern microbiologists, even though they had no idea what yeast actually was. They knew that this foamy stuff from beer making could transform heavy, flat dough into light, airy bread. They also knew that mixing fresh barm with yesterday's leftover dough created something even more powerful, what we now call a preferment. Willem scoops out a portion of yesterday's preferment, checking its smell and texture with the expertise of someone who's done this thousands of times. The apprentice watches every movement, trying to memorize the way Willem's nose wrinkles slightly when the fermentation is just right, the way he nods with satisfaction when the consistency passes his test. The mixing process that follows would make any modern baker jealous. No electric mixers, no precise measurements, just hands, experience, and an intuitive understanding of how flour, water, and fermentation work together. Willem begins combining the balm and preferment with fresh flour, creating a shaggy mass that doesn't look like much yet. Here's where the real education begins. The apprentice gets his first lesson in reading dough, a skill that separates master bakers from everyone else. Willem explains that dough talks to you if you know how to listen. The way it feels between your fingers, the way it responds to stretching, even the sound it makes when you slap it on the work surface. All of these things tell you whether your bread will be a success or a disaster. The kneading that follows is nothing like the gentle folding you might do at home. This is serious physical labor that builds the gluten structure needed to trap the gases from fermentation. Willem's arms work like pistons, pushing and folding the dough with a rhythm that's been perfected over decades. The apprentice tries to copy the technique, but his movements are clumsy and uneven. Willem doesn't criticize. He just demonstrates again, showing how the dough should feel when it's ready. As the night progresses, the workshop fills with the sounds of serious bread making. The fire crackles steadily in the oven, gradually heating the thick stones to the perfect temperature. The dough makes soft, slapping sounds as it's worked and shaped. Willem's tools, wooden peels for loading bread, sharp knives for scoring, brushes for cleaning the hearth, each have their own particular sound when used properly. The scaling process reveals just how precise medieval bakers had to be without modern tools. Willem divides the massive batch of dough into individual portions, weighing each one by hand. His fingers have become so calibrated over the years that he can judge weight to within a few ounces just by lifting the dough. The apprentice tries the same technique and misses by pounds, earning a patient shake of the head from his master. Each portion gets rounded into a tight ball, then left to rest on the floured bench. This resting period gives the gluten time to relax, making the final shaping easier. While they wait, Willem checks the oven temperature using a technique that would seem like magic to modern bakers. He holds his hand near the hearth opening, counting slowly. The time he can hold his palm there tells him exactly how hot the stones have become. The shaping that follows transforms those simple balls of dough into the distinctive forms that will soon become bread. Some get shaped into round boules, others into long loaves that will feed entire families. Willem's hands move with practiced confidence, creating tight surface tension that will help the bread hold its shape during baking. The apprentice struggles with this technique, producing loaves that look more like abstract art than food. As dawn approaches, the real test begins. Willem teaches his apprentice to read the proof, the final rise that determines whether bread will be light and airy or dense and heavy. This isn't something you can time with a clock. You have to feel the dough, watching for subtle changes in its surface that indicate the yeast has done its work. The apprentice learns to look for what Willem calls the dough's skin, the way the surface develops a slight sheen when fermentation reaches its peak. The loading process requires split-second timing and years of practice. Willem slides his wooden peel under each loaf, then with a quick wrist snap, deposits it onto the hot hearthstones. The pattern he uses isn't random. He's maximizing space while ensuring each loaf has room to expand. One wrong move and hours of work could end up as a collapsed mess on the oven floor. Just as the first loaves go into the oven, footsteps echo from the street outside. A city official appears in the doorway, carrying the tools of his trade: scales, weights, and an official seal. The assize has arrived for his regular inspection, ready to ensure that Willem's bread meets the strict standards that govern medieval commerce. The assize inspection isn't just a formality, it's a matter of life and reputation in medieval commerce. This city official has the power to shut down Willem's operation, fine him heavily, or worse, ban him from baking altogether. The apprentice watches nervously as the inspector pulls out his brass scales. The the same ones used throughout the city to ensure every baker plays by the rules. Willem remains calm during the inspection, but his apprentice can see the slight tension in his master's shoulders. Every loaf gets weighed, every price gets checked against the official rates set by the city council. Medieval bread wasn't just food. It was regulated commerce that could make or break a baker's livelihood. The inspector's seal, pressed into a small piece of clay, will mark Willem's shop as officially approved for another week. But then disaster strikes. One batch of loaves comes up light on the scales. Not by much, maybe an ounce or two per loaf, but enough to raise the inspector's eyebrows. The apprentice holds his breath, wondering if this is where his brief career as a baker's helper comes to an abrupt end. Willem's jaw tightens, but he doesn't panic. Instead, he calmly adds extra dough to the light loaves, reshaping them with practiced hands. The real drama unfolds when a merchant arrives early for his regular pickup, clearly impatient to get his bread loaded and on the road. This isn't just any customer. He's one of Willem's best clients, someone who buys dozens of loaves every morning to supply workers at a nearby construction site. The merchant taps his foot impatiently while Willem fixes the underweight batch, muttering about schedules and demanding his bread immediately. Willem faces a choice that reveals everything about medieval business ethics. He could hand over the light loaves, satisfy his impatient customer, and hope the inspector doesn't notice, or he can take the time to make things right, risking the merchant's anger and potentially losing valuable business. Without hesitation, Willem chooses his reputation over quick profit, carefully adding dough to each light loaf and reshaping them properly. The merchant's complaints grow louder, but Willem doesn't budge. His apprentice watches this lesson in integrity unfold, understanding that a baker's reputation takes years to build and seconds to destroy. When the inspector finally approves the corrected batch and presses his official seal into the clay marker, Willem's shoulders relax slightly. The merchant gets his bread, grumbling but ultimately satisfied with the quality he's come to expect. As the first rays of sunlight filter through the workshop windows, the real payoff begins. Cart after cart pulls up outside Willem's shop, drivers ready to distribute fresh bread throughout the city. The apprentice helps load the still warm loaves, marveling at how the simple ingredients they started with at midnight have transformed into the foundation of the community's daily sustenance. The loading process reveals the true scale of medieval bread production. Willem's small workshop produces enough bread to feed hundreds of people every single day. The apprentice counts as they load: 50 loaves to the construction site, 30 to the monastery, 20 to the wealthy merchant's household, dozens more to individual customers who will line up when the shop officially opens. Each loaf represents hours of careful work, from banking yesterday's coals to reading the perfect moment for loading. The apprentice realizes he's witnessed something remarkable, a manufacturing process that requires no complex machinery, no written instructions, just accumulated knowledge passed from master to student through countless nights of shared labor. Willem's final lesson comes as the last cart rolls away into the brightening streets. He breaks off the heel from a particularly perfect loaf, still warm from the oven, and hands it to his apprentice with simple instructions. Take this to your mother. The gesture isn't charity, it's recognition that the apprentice has survived another night in the demanding world of medieval baking. The apprentice pockets the warm bread, feeling its heat through his rough cloth shirt. This small piece of bread represents more than just food for his family. It's proof that he's learning a trade that will feed him for life. In a world where most people live one failed harvest away from starvation, knowing how to make bread is security itself. As the workshop finally grows quiet, Willem begins tallying the night's work in his head. 3 separate firings of the oven, each one perfectly timed to maximize heat and minimize fuel waste. Oven temperatures judged not by instruments, but by decades of experience reading the color of heated stones. More than 100 loaves produced and distributed before most of the city even wakes up. The cleanup process reveals just how much work goes into those few hours of intense production. Flour dust coats every surface, dough scraps need scraping from the wooden benches, and the oven requires careful banking of coals for tomorrow night's work. The apprentice learns that baking doesn't end when the last loaf leaves the oven. It's a continuous cycle that connects each day's work to the next. Willem checks the remaining preferment, already planning tomorrow's production. The living dough culture that makes their bread possible requires constant care and feeding. Too much neglect and the fermentation dies, forcing them to start over with fresh barm from the alehouse. Too much feeding and the culture becomes overly active, creating bread with unpredictable results. The apprentice watches his master prepare for the next cycle, understanding that medieval baking operates on rhythms that have nothing to do with clocks or calendars. The work flows according to fermentation schedules, oven heating cycles, and the daily needs of a community that depends on fresh bread to survive. As morning light floods the workshop, the apprentice realizes he's been part of something that connects him to every baker who came before and everyone who will follow. The techniques Willem taught him tonight are the same ones used by bakers across Europe, passed down through generations of masters and apprentices who understood that feeding people is both simple and impossibly complex. The morning rush brings a different kind of chaos to Willem's bakery. Word has spread through the neighborhood that fresh bread is ready, and customers begin gathering outside before the official opening. The apprentice peers through the small window, watching housewives clutch their copper coins and servants from wealthy households jostle for position in the growing line. Willem surveys his domain with the satisfaction of someone who's just pulled off another successful night shift. The workshop still radiates heat from the cooling oven, and the smell of fresh bread permeates every corner. But even as he prepares to open for business, his mind is already working on tomorrow's challenges. The weather looks like it might turn rainy, which means adjusting fermentation times. The grain merchant mentioned that the latest wheat shipment has slightly different moisture content, requiring modifications to his standard recipes. The apprentice gets his first lesson in customer relations as Willem unlocks the heavy wooden door. Medieval bread buying wasn't like strolling through a modern grocery store. Customers knew their baker personally, understood his reputation, and expected consistent quality day after day. A housewife examines a loaf with the expertise of someone who's fed a family for 20 years, pressing the crust to check for a proper baking, inhaling deeply to assess the fermentation. What strikes the apprentice most is how Willem remembers every customer's preferences. The monastery cook always wants his loaves slightly underbaked because they'll go back in the oven for evening meals. The wealthy merchant's household prefers smaller loaves that won't go stale before they're consumed. The construction workers need dense, hearty bread that will stick to their ribs through a day of heavy labour. Each transaction involves more than just exchanging coins for bread. Willem asks about sick family members, remembers which customers' children are getting married, and knows who's struggling financially without ever making them feel embarrassed about counting their pennies twice. The apprentice realizes that being a medieval baker means being woven into the fabric of community life in ways that go far beyond just making food. The pricing system reveals another layer of complexity that the apprentice never considered. Bread prices aren't fixed. They fluctuate based on grain costs, season, and even political situations. When grain is expensive, loaves get smaller rather than more costly, ensuring that even poor families can afford their daily bread. Willem keeps careful mental track of these adjustments, balancing his need to make a living with his responsibility to feed the community. As the morning crowd thins out, Willem begins teaching his apprentice about the business side of medieval baking. Those warm loaves represent significant investment in raw materials, fuel, and labour. Flour alone accounts for nearly 60% of production costs, and every grain of it must be accounted for. Waste isn't just inefficient, it can mean the difference between profit and bankruptcy. The apprentice learns that successful medieval bakers are part craftsman, part businessman, and part community leader. Willem maintains relationships with grain merchants, negotiates fuel costs with charcoal suppliers, and even extends credit to customers during hard times. The workshop operates on trust and reputation, built over decades of consistent quality and fair dealing. But the real education comes when Willem explains the seasonal challenges that modern bakers never face. Winter means shorter days and higher fuel costs for heating both the workshop and the oven. Spring brings new grain with different baking properties. Summer heat can cause dough to over-ferment before you realize what's happening. Autumn means preparing for months when fresh ingredients become scarce and expensive. The apprentice watches Willem examine the day's remaining inventory with practiced eyes. Nothing goes to waste in medieval baking. Day-old bread gets sold at reduced prices to customers who will use it for puddings or feed it to livestock. Bread that's too stale for human consumption becomes valuable animal feed. Even crumbs get saved and mixed into tomorrow's dough, adding flavor and reducing waste. Storage presents constant challenges that require creative solutions. The workshop has designated areas for different stages of the bread-making process, each with its own requirements. Fresh dough needs cool, stable conditions. Rising loaves require warmth but not too much heat. Finished bread must stay dry but not become hard. Willem has organized his space with the efficiency of someone who's learned through experience what works and what leads to disaster. The apprentice discovers that medieval baking operates according to rhythms that connect individual workshops to broader economic cycles. Harvest seasons bring abundant grain and lower prices, allowing bakers to experiment with richer recipes and larger loaves. Lean months require careful rationing and simplified production. Political upheavals can disrupt grain supplies, forcing bakers to adapt recipes or find alternative sources. Quality control in medieval times relies entirely on human senses and experience. Willem can detect slight off-flavors that indicate problems with fermentation, spot visual clues that suggest oven temperature issues, and feel textural differences that reveal ingredient problems. The apprentice tries to develop these same skills, but realizes it will take years to match his master's expertise. The guild system adds another layer of complexity to medieval baking. Willem belongs to the local bakers' guild, which sets standards, regulates prices, and mediates disputes between bakers and customers. Guild membership provides protection and credibility, but also requires adherence to strict rules about ingredients, weights, and business practices. The apprentice learns that becoming a master baker involves not just technical skills, but understanding the political and social systems that govern the trade. As afternoon approaches, Willem begins preparing for the next cycle. The oven needs careful management to maintain proper temperature for tomorrow's baking. The preferment requires attention to keep the fermentation culture healthy and active. Fresh supplies must be ordered and existing inventory checked for quality. The apprentice realizes that successful baking requires constant forward thinking and preparation. The workshop transforms as evening approaches, shifting from retail space back to production facility. Tools get cleaned and organized, work surfaces prepared, and ingredients measured for the night's work. The apprentice helps with these preparations, understanding that every step connects to tomorrow's success or failure. Willem shares stories of other bakers he's known, masters who built legendary reputations, apprentices who failed to learn essential skills, and the occasional disaster that taught valuable lessons. These tales aren't just entertainment. They're educational tools that help the apprentice understand the broader context of their craft. Each story contains practical wisdom about handling difficult customers, managing ingredient quality, or dealing with equipment failures. The social aspects of medieval baking extend far beyond the workshop walls. Bakers often serve as informal bankers, extending credit during hard times and helping community members manage financial difficulties. They're sources of news and information, connecting different parts of the community through their daily interactions. Willem explains that earning trust takes years, but losing it can happen in a single transaction. As darkness begins to fall and the midnight bell approaches once again, the apprentice understands that he's witnessed just one complete cycle in an endless rhythm that keeps communities fed. The techniques he's learning tonight are the same ones that sustained his parents' generation and will feed his own children someday. Medieval baking isn't just a trade. It's a tradition that connects past, present, and future through the simple act of transforming grain into sustenance. The apprentice takes his position beside Willem as they prepare to bank the coals and begin another night's work. His hands are no longer clumsy with the tools, his timing slightly better than yesterday. The warm heel of bread in his pocket reminds him that this demanding craft offers rewards beyond just earning a living. In a world where hunger is never far away, knowing how to make bread means holding the power to nourish and sustain life itself. The workshop settles into its familiar midnight rhythm as Willem demonstrates the delicate balance between science and intuition that defines medieval baking. Every movement has purpose. Every decision carries weight. The apprentice watches his master check the preferment one final time, noting how Willem's experienced nose can detect fermentation problems that would be invisible to untrained senses. Tonight's batch presents new challenges that will test everything the apprentice has learned. The grain merchant delivered wheat from a different region yesterday, and Willem explains how subtle variations in protein content and moisture levels can completely change how dough behaves. What worked perfectly last week might produce dense, heavy loaves tonight if they don't adjust their technique accordingly. The mixing process reveals these differences immediately. The new flour absorbs water differently, requiring Willem to add liquid gradually while monitoring the dough's texture. The apprentice tries to help, but his inexperienced hands can't feel the subtle changes that tell Willem exactly when to stop adding water. Too much, and the dough becomes sticky and unworkable. Too little, and the finished bread will be dry and crumbly. Willem's teaching methods become apparent as he guides his apprentice through these adjustments. Rather than simply giving instructions, he places his hands over the apprentice's, letting him feel how properly mixed dough should respond to kneading. The sensation is completely different from what the apprentice expected. Not soft like clay, but elastic and alive, almost breathing under their combined pressure. The physical demands of kneading hundreds of pounds of dough each night have shaped Willem's body over 3 decades of work. His forearms are massive from constant kneading, his back permanently curved from bending over work tables, and his hands have developed a permanent flour coating that no amount of washing can remove. The apprentice's muscles already ache after just a few weeks, but Willem assures him that strength builds gradually if he doesn't quit first. Temperature management becomes crucial as the night progresses. The workshop must stay warm enough for proper fermentation, but not so hot that dough rises too quickly. Willem has developed an intuitive understanding of how his building responds to weather changes, adjusting oven firing schedules based on whether the night air feels damp or dry. The apprentice learns to read these subtle environmental cues that can make the difference between perfect bread and costly mistakes. The shaping process tonight requires extra attention because of the new flour's different handling characteristics. Willem demonstrates how to adjust his technique, creating slightly less surface tension to compensate for the grain's lower protein content. The apprentice struggles with these modifications, producing loaves that look acceptable but lack the tight structure that will help them rise properly during final proofing. As the shaped loaves rest on their floured boards, Willem begins preparing the oven for loading. The temperature must be precisely calibrated for this particular batch, and he's learned that new grain varieties often require slight adjustments to standard heating schedules. Too hot, and the crusts will burn before the centers cook through. Too cool, and the bread will be dense and gummy. The apprentice gets his first real test when Willem assigns him to monitor the proofing while preparing the loading area. Reading proof correctly requires understanding how dough should feel at different stages of fermentation, knowledge that only comes through handling thousands of loaves. The apprentice pokes each loaf gently, trying to judge whether the dough springs back with the right amount of resistance. The midnight bell echoes once more through the cobblestone streets, and Willem's workshop prepares for another cycle. As our young apprentice settles into his rhythm beside his master, we've witnessed something extraordinary, a world where feeding an entire community depended on hands, experience and knowledge passed down through generations. From banking coals to reading dough like ancient scripture, medieval bakers created sustenance through pure skill and determination. The next time you bite into fresh bread, remember Willem and his apprentice working through the darkness, proving that some of history's greatest achievements happened not in palaces or battlefields, but in humble workshops where ordinary people did extraordinary work, one loaf at a time.